Hey, this is Mike Lindsay, and today we're going to be talking about the 2020 KX250 and KX450. Now, this should be the last batch of motocross, tech info videos we do for this year. Pretty much from this point on, we're moving into testing season. Actually, specifically, the KX250 released the info they released about the updates to this bike. We are riding that bike on July 9th or 10th. They just sent out the intro info for that. KTM 450 is not this Friday, but the following Friday. So just finally about into testing season. So we're almost there. But to get through what has changed on this bike, the KX250 this year, I don't think is getting maybe the changes that people expected after seeing the 450 last year, but it actually does have quite the list or host of changes. Just a lot more of them are internal or just items that aren't as visually standing out. Starting out is it did get a big update on the engine. The cylinder head has gone to a finger follower design instead of a cam over bucket, which the 450 got that type of cylinder head last year, and that's kind of the direction everybody in moto seems to finally be moving to. I mean, KTM has had it for quite some time now. Honda moved that direction finally. We have the KYB 450, now the KYB 250. In that direction as well. That really leaves just the Yamaha and the Suzuki, and I've heard rumors about the Yamaha heading that direction. I was actually a bit surprised their 450 didn't this year. Really what is the idea that the design is to get a overall better spread of power and more control of the valve at a higher RPM with the finger follower design. So that's a big one. That entire head has been redesigned. The cams have been redesigned. Usually the cam lobe is quite a bit different in shape when dealing with a finger follower. So all that's been updated. And albeit the bottom end of the engine looks the same, there actually has been a few changes there because they've also changed the bore and stroke on the bike, which I was actually pretty surprised about because Kawi has used the same bore and stroke, I believe, since 04. Basically, themselves, Yamaha, and Suzuki have all used the exact same measurements at 77 by 53.6 millimeters, 77 being the bore. They did go ahead, like I said, they've changed that this year. It has jumped up to 78 by 52.2, so they've gone to a bigger bore, shorter stroke. It's a little bit more in line with like what the KTM is. And the Honda on that sense. Of course, their claim for this is they wanted to step to that wider bore so they could use a larger intake and exhaust valve to really change that flow for higher RPMs, plus having the shorter stroke for the high RPM output. Really, the changes for this come as a little bit obvious. The Kawi has slipped back a little bit in the engine department the past couple seasons. And really, when everybody rides the bike, what's interesting is it's been fairly low on just straight dyno results. And in the Suzuki were pretty even in 2019, but down at the bottom of the charts. But the bike is so well mapped and crisp initially when we do shootout with it. A lot of the riders come back in and they're very surprised that it would be that low on the dyno because they ride it and the experience is really good. It's a very usable power. It's very useful, but it kind of slipped off that top end pull. While it's really good low to mid, it's definitely a little bit of short shifter. It goes a little flat up top compared to where the rest of these bikes have gone to. Speaking a little bit more about the valvetrain, the finger followers themselves have a diamond-like carbon or DLC coating on them to protect against wear. It has, like I said, a lot different cam profile. It's a lot more aggressive to run the large diameter intake and exhaust valves. They've increased the lift quite a bit. They're basically just trying to get more air into the engine. They already have the advantage in fuel per se. They've been the bike for the longest time with dual fuel injection stock. So there is a fuel injector inside the throttle body, but there's also one upstream just in the air boot right behind the fuel filter element. So they have the capability to run plenty of fuel into the bike. Now they can get more air in there and just try to get more overall power out of it. Other than the new piston itself with the increased bore, the cylinder has also been offset 3 millimeters forward. The idea there is you reduce mechanical loss when it comes up to its firing order with that offset. It gives the rod a little bit of a straighter push up and down right up to, I believe it's right up to about the point of combustion. It gives a different leverage on the bottom end. So that's been added as well for this 2020 model. Another big one is the change in the airbox. Like everybody's been trying to do the past couple years, really since the Yamaha debuted in 14 with the downdraft style intake, is everybody else is trying to take a traditional layout but decrease the angle going into the engine as much as possible, trying to get that sharp flow. So they've redesigned the air boot coming out of the airbox, even though it's in the same basic platform. They have raised it up and tried to decrease that angle coming in. Now, sadly, the tech release for this one, for some reason, has not been given to us with a exact spec sheet. So there is one item that's kind of interesting here. It claims a large diameter throttle body. The past couple years, I believe they've been on either a 43 or 44 millimeter, so it may have jumped up to a 45, 46. They can basically order whatever they want from Kian. There may be a small change as well on the throttle body size with the increase in air requirements and the ability to increase that fuel requirement. They may have jumped up the throttle body size just a little bit. Kawasaki is also keeping their what they call their DFI coupler system, so they don't really have a map switch per se on the handlebars. There's a simple coupler you can change, which they basically have a green, white, and black. Green is always your base map. Interesting thing, if you didn't know it, the green coupler is literally a placeholder. So if you were to unplug the green coupler and leave it off the bike still starts and runs because the green is just the base map. The white and black change the attributes of the map to a leaner or fatter based off what the base map is. So the green plug, realistically, like I said, is more of a placeholder. I've done it before. You can actually take it off the bike and actually run it, and it runs in its normal standard base map with no problems. The bike does come equipped with a launch control. It seems to be a little bit more the system that we saw when everybody went to these systems earlier on. It labels it as a push button that activates a different map for first and second gear to help maximize traction on slippery surfaces. While most brands have gone to a launch control in the past couple years, past year to three, that is more like a race team's launch map. Well, some race teams, a lot of riders actually still prefer to just launch the bike in a standard map, but for the teams that do use it, it is usually more of an aggressive launch feature because in the professional ranks, they do run on dirt starts or the greats and supercross, which have plenty of traction. It's usually got a max RPM limiter based into it to just allow for more repetition to the launch itself, but this one just seems to be a little bit more of one of those calmer maps. It literally labels it. It's meant for slippery surfaces like concrete starting pads. So this map is a little bit more of a mellow launch, actually, compared to just doing it all manually. As for the chassis, here's the biggest thing where I'm sure people are expecting something else. The bodywork and the chassis, they were expecting the KX450 look. And I was a little bit surprised when I heard a few months back that we weren't getting all those changes this year. And really, it has to do a bit with the product cycles on these bikes stock. So typically Kawasaki has been running 4 years per model, and that would make this the 4th year of the KX250. So it makes sense that it's still in this chassis. The KX450 getting updated last year meant they only did a 3-year product cycle on that bike before that, which was interesting. They did 16, 17, 18, and then swapped for 19. That really, from the rumors I've heard, that had a lot to do with them feeling like in the 450 class that they were slipping behind a little bit. They wanted to get that bike out early, so they put a lot of focus on the development of it to try to step out there a year early, while the KX250, on the other hand, has stayed on a standard development path. Now, what that does mean is it's pretty obvious to say that we will see those changes for 2021. The chassis and bodywork design will get changed that year, but for this year they have retained the current chassis. It's a great bike for definitely smaller riders. It has a very short foot peg to seat height and standard position with the bar mounts adjustability. They still have all that and the peg adjustability, peg mount. It's a really easy bike for smaller riders to feel comfortable in. Kids just coming off of 85s or 125s onto this bike. It definitely has one of the smaller cockpit feels. The seat is extremely skinny. Definitely a bike that's really easy for a small kid to get on and feel a little bit more comfortable than, say, the Yamaha, which is still a little overall bulkier, or the KTM and Husky, which are a little bit taller in profile in general. Updates to the chassis, though, do include a different front engine mount. Things like this get changed all the time. Actually, myself and a friend personally own a business called Works Chassis Lab. We do all the engine mounts for the factory Kawi team, MCR, Honda, Star Racing, Yamaha, MX101, Rock River, Shurka, a bunch of teams we're testing proc with. Yeah, all this stuff makes a difference. Won 2 championships with the Elite Tomac, changing out the our own design of front and top engine mounts on the bike, and this is something for that reason. OEMs do this all the time. It's not always mentioned in great detail every year, but they change the thicknesses or the materials of the mounts all the time, usually trying to change the load. The front engine mounts specifically usually seem to change a lot of front end stability, a lot of front end feel under braking and turn in response. So just even a small change like that can change the handling of this bike a decent amount. Now, another really big change on this bike is a suspension swap from Showa to KYB. Now, Kawasaki is definitely one of the manufacturers that quite commonly will split duties of suspension brands on their bike. I believe 0405 was KYB on the 250, and then 06 and up has been Showa, while the KX450 was initially released in 06 with KYB, and I believe it made it all the way to 13 or 14 with KYB 404, switching to Showa when the TAC fork came out. They went KYB spring for a long time, then they had a PSF1 fork for 1 to 2 years, and then went to Showa TAC. So now they're finally splitting in because they've had both of their 4-stroke motocross models on Showa for a few years now. It's funny how long some of this stuff takes. So I was told that this KYB switch was coming to the KX250 nearly 3 years ago. It might have been more. So based on product cycles, it was 2 years ago was the first time I thought it might pop up. Last year I was completely expecting it, and this year it's finally been released. So big change here that I'm really stoked about is more the system or design of the suspension switch. The KX250 has held on to the SFF spring fork design since 2011. I am absolutely not a fan of that fork. I know some people have their negative feelings towards air forks. I would take a Showa TAC fork every day of the week over a separate function spring fork. And the reason being is that one giant spring on one side creates quite a bit of imbalance and rigidity issues inside the fork. And anybody that wants to say that the forks work in perfect unison because of their size and the axle and everything, just take apart a set with 15 hours and look at the bushings on each side of the fork. The side with the giant single spring in it has way less wear than the cartridge damping only side because the amount of flex difference between those two forks. The other part is there's a hard area to set up with that fork. That fork to me has a very narrow operating window and also with weight, and it's a fork that you continually have to slightly underspring because if you slightly overspring it for what your weight is, that one side just you feel so much binding in the action. So I'm really stoked to see them go from a 48 millimeter separate function spring fork to a 48 millimeter KYB coil spring fork on each side. So we have damping being done on both sides of the fork and spring force on each side of the fork. The fork itself is actually the newest version of the KYB. So for the longest time, KYB has just had the same cartridge and piston designs and everything. And then the Yamahas last year got an update from a 24 to a 25 millimeter damping rod piston and upped the size of the cartridge a little bit. But then when the Suzuki 250 came out with the KYB fork in 19 on the 250, it was the older 24 millimeter design that Yamaha had used forever. This version over here on the Kawi is the 25 millimeter version, so they have the per se latest and greatest from KYB in that sense. The thing that is super interesting for me on the fork is the lack of DLC or tinitride coating. Kawi has been on this train for a long time. I believe the 450 went to DLC with KYB in 08, and then the Showa fork picked it up in 09. Might have been even a little earlier. With the Showa fork, they did either, I think it was a tinitrate on that, so basically a black lower coating, and Kawi has continued to have that on their production forks for years. The KX450 still has that coating, so it's not really an issue of which suspension manufacturer is doing it. They've had a lower coating with both KYB and Showa in the past, and they've chosen not to do it on the 250 this year. Basically, the first time they have taken it back away from a model's feature list since it was initially brought in nearly 10 years ago. The shock is an update as well. The body really hasn't had to be redesigned like the 450, considering the platform's still the same, but it's a switch to a KYB shock. Componentry wise, it's not really that different from a Showa in sense of dimensions. It's a 50mm piston, 16mm shaft. Compression adjuster housing is very similar. It's not the bigger compression adjuster housing that we see on the newest KX450. It's the standard size we see from KYB, high and low speed compression. It's not the 3-prong adjuster that they've popped up on some models. It's still a very traditional, just high and low speed. They have also upgraded the brake disc on the rear to a 250mm like the KX450. And what I find pretty interesting with that is my personal bike, I swapped it back to the 240, and the race team is also on a 240. For the most part, the 250 is a little bit overkill in a lot of situations. It's easy to lock and drag. It doesn't have as much modulation feel, and it's pretty easy to cook the rear fluid with. So to me, it's a small change, but it's something I'm not personally a huge fan of. Lastly, other than that, the bike is now pretty much all green for its final year. A little bit different look. No black side plates, no white side plates, just all green look. And that's pretty much what covers the changes going into this year. Like I said, we don't really have a tech spec sheet for this bike, so I'm just going to go ahead and screenshot all the press information, and it'll be listed here at the end of the video. By this point, you've probably been seeing it play out. The bike is, by they claim, availability now, so it should be delivering into dealers within this week or two. The MSRP is $7,799, which is a $50 increase over last year's model. So that covers it for the KX250. Like I said, for a bike that visually has not changed as much, there's actually quite a bit going on there. To answer two simple questions that I did not bring up in the info, because I'm sure some people are asking it just after reading through it. No, it does not have electric start like the 450. It is still kickstart. I would expect electric start for 21 though, and it is still a cable clutch, not the hydraulic system that the KX450 got as well. So that leaves in the 250 class the Suzuki and Kawi are the last two kickstart bikes. 450 class, it's just the Suzuki 450. So moving on, 2020 KX450. This bike was all new last year, definitely the biggest one-year change that Kawasaki has ever made, and it was a huge success. I mean, did great in shootouts. Feedback on that bike has been amazing. There's just a lot of big firsts for Kawasaki on that bike. Like I said, the finger follower design, redesigning the engine to electric start only while still losing weight, going back to a spring fork, going to the 49mm A-kit style A01 Showa fork, a new shock layout with a larger compression adjuster housing. Just overall, quite a few things in there. The first Japanese motocross bike to have a hydraulic clutch, and a Nissan one at that. Just an overall new ergonomics design of the bike, and that all, of course, carries over for this year. And the only change is BNG for them. It does have an all-green plastic layout. The one thing I'm interested in that is not exactly explained in this PR, and it's the only possible change I could see for the bike, is maybe a small update on the suspension settings. What we found in shootout a lot last year is that the shock overpowers the fork just a little bit. Stock fork comes with 5.0 spring rate in it, or 0.50s, which is pretty common for a 450, same as the Honda and the Suzuki. We were putting 5.2 in one side for like that 170 and 190 pound hour to hold it up. For more my weight, like the 150 150 to 165, under 170 range. It's a little better to drop the shock spring one rate, try to balance it out. Also adding a little bit of oil volume to the fork helps quite a bit. They've got a bit of a low oil volume in there, so it doesn't have a ton of bottom resistance, keeps it very initially plush, but it just doesn't seem to have a lot of speed sensitivity that it could have by just increasing that oil volume a little bit more to the level that's what's found on the Suzuki and Honda with that same design of fork on board. But like I said, it doesn't list it. I wouldn't be surprised if there is a small suspension tweak, but I guess we'll find out when the bike intro comes around for that one. But for now, it's just listing basically the plastic update. Like I said, it was a big year for them last year, so they're really just carrying that over into this next year. Same thing, availability lists as now. So should be hitting dealers this week or next week. And that about covers it for all of our 2020 bike info for motocross models. I've got a couple enduro models I'm going to catch up on, but that's really pretty much it. KTM, Suzuki, Yamaha, Honda videos are up. Like I said, we're getting into testing season. KTM 450 is the first one next week. Husky to follow. KY250 here is pretty soon. Even though a lot of the 450s haven't changed, I think they're still, the intros for them are going to be a little bit late, like later July. But these videos are going to start coming out, and we're going to start getting that info out to you guys. If you like what you see on this channel, please hit subscribe, throw comments in about any further questions about the bike, and thanks for watching.